Okay, I'm Barry Maxwell and be presenting on nationalism in the Middle East as the concept of nationalism forms in Europe and then makes its way into the idea of moving from empires to more modern states in the Middle East. So a definition of what it means to be a nation. Again, a group of people that feel themselves to be a people with a name, with a commonality of ideas, attitudes, beliefs that they are a we and an us, often, but not always, with some of these common things: language, religion, history, culture, and so on. Usually they'll share some of these. They don't need to share all of them to be a nation. And I'll point out that being a nation does not mean you have a plot of ground you can call your own. You might, but might not. They're not the same thing, and could be spread across other existing empires or states. And by states, we're not talking about California or Washington. We're talking about states in the sense of being a sovereign country. Nationalism is the political movement that happens when this group of people decides they do in fact want their own state and are willing to do quite a bit to get it, usually. To include impressing others with the need to become part of the group and strive for this as the most important identity that they're going to have. Others might be allowed or might not, especially if they seem to be competing for loyalty. And almost always there's some other person, other group, foreigners, or just somebody that's not part of your group that has been oppressing you and needs to be struggled against. And it may be one other group or maybe the whole rest of the world. This power of nationalism grows substantially as a concept and in practice out of the French Revolution and as a product of the Napoleonic Wars that come afterwards. So where do this idea of states come from? It didn't used to be there. For most of America, or people's history everywhere in the world, you had empires, maybe kingdoms, but the idea that you would have a fixed boundary with recognized borders that remained relatively constant with an agreed upon ruler was relatively new. The idea starts to come out of the 30 Years' War, early 1600s in Europe. Horrible war. It just devastated the people, the countryside, the economies. It was so awful that the survivors decided we need a different way of doing business, and came the agreement that they would let kings run their own area without interfering with each other, recognize boundaries that weren't completely stable, but much more so than ever been before. And this idea that to some extent you'd try and include within these boundaries groups of people that saw themselves as a people. So the idea of starting to think about aligning nations with states. Now, you have the evolution that happens, very emotional, intense time. The French throw off their monarchy and start to feel themselves to be united as Frenchmen, so much so that they're going to take on the rest of Europe, get rid of all these other monarchies, and spread this idea of self-government with no kings to the rest of Europe. And Napoleon uses nationalism, this sense of being oppressed by others, because the other monarchies tried to stop all this, to build an army that the world had never seen before. Not just because he was a good general, but he had motivated Frenchmen that wanted to fight, willing to fight. Remember that up to this point in time, most armies were built out of draftees and conscripts that were just grabbed and thrown into the army. These folks wanted to fight, protect their country that had formed, and go off and spread the revolution. Now, when they do this and occupy all of Europe except Great Britain and even parts of Russia, the occupied then become the we that want to get rid of the Frenchmen. So you have Spanish becoming Spaniards, people in the Germanic areas becoming, and this goes a long way to uniting peoples against the French occupations that never would have happened otherwise. And so much has been talked about and written about this formation of nations as they then formed into states and countries. So the concert of Europe, where again the survivors trying to make sure this doesn't happen again, put together a system of regulation, part of which leads to a relatively peaceful formation of the state of Germany out of smaller Germanic tribes. Not completely peaceful, but compared to the big wars of previous times, yeah. So, a map of the European system after the 1948 peace of West. I'm sorry, 1648 peace of West. Part of the beginnings of the modern map. France, England, Poland, Sweden up above, Spain to the lower left. More modern look at Europe as it evolves out of the concert of Europe by 1900. Not that different than today's map of Europe. And this idea makes its way to the Middle East, having been so prominent in Europe. You have a lot of Middle Easterners that have traveled to Europe in the 1800s to learn about European ways, modern technology, modern economics, modern business, trying to figure out why the Europes are whipping their butt all over the place, from Napoleon in 1798 all the way up to the British occupation in the 1880s of Egypt and other places. So you have a lot of unhappy inhabitants of the Middle East that don't trust their own rulers, don't like the occupiers, and are looking for something new, and nationalism is it for many of them. The old identity of many of them, members of the community of Islam, as Muslims, is still there, but just doesn't seem to be enough to protect them from these outside declining fortunes. So they're looking for something additional to that. And not all the Arabs or other inhabitants were Muslims. You had a significant Christian community in many parts of the Middle East as well. There are Ottoman rulers, which once upon a time they could feel good about being part of the Ottoman Empire, but now the Ottomans are not even able to hold their own without European help against the Russians and other invaders from Europe. Egyptians have been occupied by the British. And the inhabitants, one, don't like that, and two, not cool to be an Ottoman anymore because they can't even take care of themselves, much less everybody else. So everybody's looking for something new. And yeah, this rule by others is not cool. Arabs don't like having the Turks tell them what to do. They don't like having the British tell them what to do either. And the Persians are getting tired of the British presence and dominance in their oil-rich area of Khuzestan, and it's in southwestern Persia. So ethnicity, Arab, Persian, Turkish becomes a main focus for this idea of nation locally, and Turks do start to distinguish themselves from, they're Ottomans, but we're Turks too, which really bothers the Arabs, who come to feel that they're second-class citizens in the Ottoman Empire. So nationalist movements start. And the Arabs, recall, had these glory days when they were the rulers. You had the Arab Empire that they look back on fondly, if you recall from earlier discussions. They have their common language of Arabic, common culture of Bedouin culture, and others. And the Persians have their own separate culture and language. Farsi. They're not Arabs, by the way, and very much see themselves as separate. And they have recollections of the earlier historic times of empire, the great Persian empires. And remember Xerxes versus the Greeks and the Spartans at Thermopylae in the 300 and so on. So a 1900 map. Egypt's already controlled by the British, who control some other places. The Ottomans are still holding on to Syria, which is up in here, and the main parts of the Arabs peninsula controlled by the Ottomans also, with Mecca being here. So nationalist movement picks up speed as a product of World War I, especially the British conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The British, having a hard time winning that war, especially against the Ottomans in the Middle East, have the idea of trying to split the Arabs from the Turks and try and get the Arabs to revolt against their Ottoman rulers, with some success. Think of Lawrence of Arabia. Also, the British have to really clamp down on Arab aspirations in Egypt, which breeds a lot of resentment for the future. Again, just on protecting the Suez Canal. So to get through this war, difficult as it is for them, the British make a bunch of promises to people to try and hold their own alliances together. One of the earlier ones, Arabs revolt and we'll help you get a country, and actually promise them parts of Syria, parts of Palestine. vague as the promises are, but nonetheless they're there. Promised the French parts of various other parts of the Ottoman Empire. They've now double promised pieces of Syria, as well as other parts of the Ottoman territory. We'll look at a map in a minute. To get Jewish support back home during British elections, and hopefully Russian support with what they thought was a Jewish faction within the emerging Communist Party there. They have the idea of promising Jews a homeland in Palestine. Jews, by the way, many are now considering themselves a nation who want their own country at this point also. Not all, but many. And they've, along with others, have already pre-agreed to divide up the Turkish homeland of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Greeks are going to get a piece, the French, the Kurds, the Italians. Again, these promises cause a lot of problems with the Turkish inhabitants also. Again, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the blue areas are what the French believe they're going to get, some of which they do. British believe they're going to be able to hold on to the red areas and the yellow one, at least in the interim. And this goes into some of the mandates they create later through the League of Nations. So, Ottomans are defeated in World War I. Their empire is dissolved, carved up by the victors. The Turks, led by Kemal Ataturk, who you've heard quite a bit about, fight a post-World War I war against these invading Greeks, Armenians, the French, the Kurds, to carve out a modern-day Turkey, much to everybody's surprise. Armenia, you do get a small one established, but it's immediately dominated by both the Turks on one side and the Russians on the other, so they don't get quite what they're hoping for. The Kurds, who had great hopes and promises of getting their own state in the southeastern part of Turkey and parts of Persia and Mesopotamia, wind up with nothing, a problem that still persists today. The Arabs don't get much out of this whole thing either, not nearly what they thought they were going to get. The British hold on to Egypt and establish mandates through the League of Nations that promise future independence, but really become long-term colonial rule on the part of the British and the French, which allows the British especially to hold on to Palestine and the newly created Jordan and countries of Iraq, as well as Kuwait, by the way. And the French come in and occupy Syria, much to the dismay of the Arabs who revolt, and that's brutally put down. The Arabs or French eventually split off Lebanon and make it a separate country and rule that also up until the World War II time frame. The only ones that eventually come out with a country of their own is the Arabs in Arabia, eventually under King Saud, who forms Saudi Arabia. So a more modern map, again, out of all this, leaving the French control of Syria and Lebanon, again, up in here, and the British in Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, parts of Iran still, and these states here, and again, wanting to hold on to their control here, protecting the entrance to the Red Sea and on up to the Suez Canal. A little bit about some of the leaders we've talked about. Upper left, Kemal Ataturk, also known as Mustafa Kemal, who helped lead the Turks to their eventual nationhood. Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. Upper right, Reza Khan, who takes over in Persia, renames it Iran eventually. Abdullah of Jordan and Faisal of Iraq, put in place by Britain, but become nationalist rulers in their own right, although still under a lot of British influence.